Her story did not end with a single moment, a single tragedy to mark the final page. Instead, it dissolved slowly, like paper left in the rain, each year washing away another piece of her until there was almost nothing left. Some claim she died young, her body too fragile to bear the weight of the children she was forced to carry. Others believe she lived on, old before her time, her face pale and hollow, haunting the valley like a ghost long before death ever came for her. The records are unclear, and perhaps that is fitting. After all, her life had never truly been her own. It had always been a secret, hidden away, spoken only in murmurs, denied even as it happened. The man she had been bound to became a symbol, though not in the way her family imagined. They believed he carried on the bloodline. In truth, he carried its decay, its collapse, its horror. He was the mirror of what happens when a family closes its doors too tightly, when fear of the outside world turns into worship of the inside. His existence was not strength, it was evidence of a rot so deep that no one dared to name it. And the girl taken at 11 was the sacrifice, a child traded like property, silenced like a criminal, buried alive in a marriage that could never be called one. She was proof that families, under the weight of their own traditions, can become prisons. Proof that survival, when twisted by fear and secrecy, can create monsters instead of heirs. Even now, when her name is rarely spoken, her story lingers. It drifts in the minds of those who study forgotten communities, of those who dare to peer into the hidden corners of America where silence still reigns, and it asks a question, one that cannot be ignored. How many more stories like hers have been buried? How many children have vanished into the shadows of their own bloodlines, erased by a history too ashamed to write their names? The valley remains. Its forests still stand. Its cabins still rot slowly under the weight of time. But somewhere, in that soil, her footsteps remain. The faint trace of a child who never had a chance to be one. And when the wind cuts through the trees at night, some say you can still hear it. The quiet hum of a song without words. A lullaby she once sang to herself when no one else would. A reminder that silence is never empty. Silence remembers. Silence tells the truth. By the time she reached 17, she had lived what most would call a lifetime of grief. The lines of age etched themselves into her face long before they should have, carved there by fear and exhaustion rather than years. The man beside her had become a grotesque reflection of the family's history, his body bending further into deformity, his mind drifting further into madness, and yet he remained the center of her existence, not because she chose him, but because choice was never allowed. Neighbors, those few who dared to look closely, noticed how quiet she had become. Entire days would pass without her uttering a single word. Her silence was more than submission, it was survival. Words could draw punishment, questions could draw suspicion, and so she buried her voice deep enough that even she began to forget what it once sounded like. Some say her eyes told the story for her, wide, unblinking, and endlessly searching for something that never arrived, an escape, a rescue, a moment of mercy. None came. The valley was a graveyard of possibilities. Families who had once been vibrant had folded in on themselves, strangled by the same blood that was supposed to sustain them. To the outside world, they were ghosts, forgotten Americans whose names rarely made it beyond census papers and whispered warnings. But to those who lived there, this was life. This was normal. And it was within this normal that a girl, still barely grown, carried the crushing weight of a family's darkest inheritance. Her husband's decline only sharpened her torment. His outbursts became violent. His mutterings, once background noise, turned into screams that echoed through the night. Some claimed to see her with bruises she could not hide. Others spoke of her wandering the woods barefoot, her gown torn, her hair wild, as though she were searching desperately for a way out, but the woods always led back to the same valley, the same cabin, the same man. Escape was a circle, a cruel trick of geography and blood. When people tell her story now, they often ask why she didn't run. But to ask that question is to misunderstand. To run, one must believe there is somewhere to go. For her, the world beyond the valley was as unreachable as the stars above. She had been given a map with only one direction: inward, back into the blood, back into the decay. And so she remained, a living reminder of how silence can swallow a person whole. There are stories that still circulate, fragments of memory carried down like ghostly echoes. They say that by the time she turned 15, she had already borne the scars of womanhood forced too early. Some whispered of pregnancies that ended before they began, the toll on her body too great for nature to sustain. Others believed children were born and buried quickly, their cries silenced by a lineage too fragile to survive. The truth, like everything in that valley, was covered over with silence. But silence does not erase, it only deepens the horror. The man she was chained to, her so-called husband, was unraveling in full view. His features grew sharper, his movements more erratic. The villagers said his laughter rang out in the night like the sound of an animal caught in a trap. He wandered into the woods for hours, sometimes days, returning with mud smeared across his clothes, muttering words that made sense to no one. And still, he was protected. Still, he was preserved. Because to the family he was not broken, he was theirs. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent, bound by duty, or would you have risked everything to escape the valley's grip? For her, escape was not an option. The girl's entire world was controlled, who she could speak to, where she could walk, what she could think. Her parents, once her guardians, had become her jailers, passing her into the hands of a man who represented not just decay, but the very end of choice itself. In their eyes, it was tradition. In truth, it was erasure. Sometimes the neighbors claimed to hear her humming to herself in the dark, a sound low and mournful, a song without words. Perhaps it was the only rebellion she had left, the act of keeping something of herself alive, hidden deep beneath the layers of silence demanded of her. Or perhaps it was a lullaby, not for herself, but for the children who never lived long enough to see the world beyond the valley. Each year, she grew more like the women who came before her, bent-backed, hollow-eyed and resigned. But unlike them, she had begun her descent before her voice had even broken into the tones of adulthood. She was not just another victim of the cycle. She was the proof of how young it could begin and how young it could end. Time passed slowly in that valley, and for her, each year was another stone added to the weight already crushing her. By 13, her body was still not ready for what was expected of her, yet the expectations came all the same. The older women, themselves survivors of the same fate, whispered instructions in the dark. They told her how to endure, how to remain silent, how to let her mind drift somewhere else when her body could not escape. It was not advice born of love, but of survival. They knew what it meant to be bound to men whose blood was thick with repetition, whose tempers could flare without reason, whose grasp of reality sometimes slipped like water through clenched fists. The man she had been forced to marry grew stranger with time. His words, already fractured, became harder to understand. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, rocking gently, muttering sounds that were neither prayer nor song. His body was failing him too, limbs twisted unnaturally, movements jerky and sudden. Yet in that place, none of it was questioned. He was family, and family was destiny. To leave him, to deny him, would have been to betray blood itself. For the girl, now barely a teenager, the world beyond the valley began to take on the shimmer of myth. She heard of it only through snatches of conversation, farmers who traveled further for supplies, or a rare visitor passing through. Stories of towns with schools, with children laughing in playgrounds, with women who could say no without punishment. These stories must have seemed unreal to her, like tales of another planet. But somewhere inside, a seed of understanding began to grow. The life she was living was not the life everyone lived, and that knowledge, fragile as it was, made her suffering all the more unbearable. Neighbors noticed her frailty. They noticed the way her small frame seemed to shrink further each year, her eyes dulling, her skin pale as chalk. but no one intervened. In places like this, intervention was betrayal. Silence was safer, and so the girl faded in plain sight, her childhood long stolen, her future swallowed by a man who was less a partner than a monument to all the wrong choices that had come before him. The valley itself was a prison without bars. Families who lived there rarely left, and strangers rarely entered. Roads were little more than dirt paths that wound through thick forests, and the mountains formed walls too high for most to climb. Generations had lived and died in the same few square miles, their bloodlines coiling tighter and tighter until the very faces of the children began to repeat themselves. The girl, now a child bride, was not unique in her fate. She was simply the latest branch of a tree that had long since stopped growing outward. What made her story unbearable was the age at which she was taken. 11 years old, an age where life should stretch ahead in possibility. Instead, hers folded in on itself, collapsing into a role chosen for her before she could even choose her own favorite color. And the man she was tied to, the so-called husband, was known in hushed tones by the neighbors who lived closest. They said he carried more than just a broken body. He carried madness in his blood. The people of the valley had a way of keeping secrets. Outsiders were told half-truths, strangers were kept at a distance, and the ugliness was buried under polite nods and stiff smiles. But whispers found their way out, carried on the lips of travelers who caught glimpses of the family. Some spoke of children who looked too alike to be cousins. Some recalled voices that didn't sound quite human, laughter that echoed with something feral. And always, behind these stories, there was the man, the one she was given to at 11, whose very presence seemed to unsettle even those born into that world. The girl's family believed they were preserving themselves. To them, marrying within blood was not a horror, but a necessity, a way of keeping property, tradition, and survival bound tightly together. But what they preserved was not strength, it was decay. And the girl, Saint, standing at the center of it all, was the living sacrifice to a cycle no one dared to break. In the years that followed, her silence became a legend of its own. Some said she stopped speaking altogether. Others claimed her voice changed, deeper, flatter, as if it had absorbed the echoes of the valley itself. Whatever the truth, her childhood was gone, replaced by a marriage that was less a union than a sentence, delivered in the name of family. The man she was bound to was not simply a husband in name. He was a product of generations who had never looked beyond their own bloodline. His face bore the marks of it, his jaw slightly sunken, his speech broken into guttural sounds, his eyes carrying the vacant stare of someone who had inherited not just a family name, but all of its silent curses. To outsiders, he was an oddity. To those within the valley, he was inevitable. He was what happened when families forgot the outside world, when pride turned to fear, and fear turned to chains. She had no language for this. How could she? 11 years old, raised in shadows, she only knew the rituals of obedience. The women around her, mothers, aunts, sisters, had been through it themselves, their own girlhood stripped away and handed to men with the same sunken jaws, the same wandering eyes. They rarely spoke of their pain, but it was written in the way they moved, slow and resigned, their shoulders forever bent toward the ground. Night came quickly after the ceremony. The cabin they entered smelled of smoke and damp earth, the walls pressing in with the weight of history. Every sound was magnified, the creak of the floorboards, the shallow breathing of the man who was now her keeper, the distant howl of a dog that seemed to know something had been lost that could never be returned. She lay there, stiff as wood, her body refusing to move, her heart pounding with the rhythm of terror. The bed was too large, the room too dark, the silence too heavy. There were no witnesses to what followed, no records carved in paper or ink, but every retelling, every faded whisper from neighbors who knew of them describes the same thing, a child swallowed by a man who was less a husband than a living artifact of inbreeding, a figure built from generations of choices that should never have been made. Years later, when others would try to piece together what happened in that valley, they would say she grew pale, quiet, her eyes fixed on nothing. They would say the man grew more unstable, his body buckling under the weight of the lineage that had created him. But at that moment, on that first night, all that existed was the sound of silence, broken only by the scraping breath of a man who should never have been a husband at all. She was only 11 years old when the family decided her fate, an age where most children are still clutching dolls, learning to braid their hair, or chasing fireflies at dusk. But for her, childhood was not a gift she was allowed to keep. It was taken, traded and shackled to a man whose very existence told the story of generations collapsing inward. They called him kin. They called him a husband. Others much later would whisper a different word. Inbred. This is not a tale about love or about the innocence of youth. This is a record of a decision, a cruel binding, made in the quiet corners of a forgotten valley where family trees grew not outward but tangled into themselves. The men of that place believed it was survival. The women, if they spoke at all, knew it was a sentence. And for the girl who had not yet learned the shape of her own voice, silence was the only inheritance given to her. The wedding was not a celebration. There were no flowers, no laughter, no bright candles lighting a joyous feast. Instead, there was the dull weight of inevitability pressing down on every bowed head in the room. The man she was forced to stand beside was older, not just in years, but in the heavy shadows of his face, the uneven set of his teeth, the strange gait in his step. These were not accidents of nature, they were the scars of lineage, repeating itself again and again in closed rooms where cousins married cousins, where brothers and sisters were bound in ways they should never be. Imagine her small hands trembling as she was led forward. No escape routes, no hidden doors, only eyes watching, ensuring she obeyed. And yet, behind her pale face, behind the veil that was too large for her frame, there lived a flicker of something darker than fear, the realization that this was forever, that every path her life might have taken had been sealed by blood, by tradition, by a family too afraid to look outward into the world. This story is not fiction. It is carved into records most refuse to read, tucked away in whispers passed from neighbor to neighbor, dismissed by those who cannot bear to imagine it true. But it is true, and the girl, just 11, was trapped in a cage that bore the shape of a marriage,